Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to get right to it. I want to go over some Long Island Chess Club housekeeping, although this applies to all club players in general, which is why I'm going to mention it. Now, before I do that, some have asked me, why not call this podcast the Long Island Chess Club Podcast? Like, why do you call it the Chess Angle? Couple of reasons, and I'm just going to go through this because I know some people were asking. The name Long Island Chess Club Podcast, it's too cumbersome. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's too long for mobile devices. Like on your phone, the title's going to get cut off. I just don't like the aesthetics of that. I wanted something short, direct, and as I was thinking of the name, I said to myself, like, what's the angle I'm looking for? And I was like, there it is, the chess angle. It's short, direct. I like it. So that's why I came up with the name. Also, Long Island Chess Club Podcast, it sounds too local. It sounds like it's a podcast just for the club and we only deal with local club business, which of course is not the case. This is a general chess improvement podcast, a chess podcast about the amateur scene in general. And the fact that I run the club is just sort of a springboard for that. So a little bit of sort of how the sausage was made as far as why this is called the Chess Angle. Now, getting back to my public service announcement, if you will, I posted the following on our Long Island Chess Club Facebook page. So although this is for my local crew, I am announcing this here to an international audience of thousands because I think what I'm about to say certainly applies to most chess clubs out there, especially the smaller local chess clubs. So here it is. I'm putting on my tournament director hat. All right. So for Long Island Chess Club members and all chess club participants out there, no matter where you're playing, please clean up after yourselves. When I lock up at the end of the night, I'm often finding myself throwing out water bottles and coffee cups that are left behind. It's rude, it's inconsiderate, so please be mindful of that before leaving for the night. I'm also a little bit of a germ freak, so I don't want to have to touch other people's coffee cups and things, but there's no reason I should be cleaning up garbage. Second thing is, you need to purchase your own chess equipment and bring it to the club. Now, here in the States, I'm not sure how it works in other parts of the world or in major clubs like the Marshall, but for most local chess clubs, equipment's not provided and you need to bring your own. Now, again, I mentioned like the Marshall, those major clubs, actually, I do believe that they provide equipment, at least boards and pieces, but those are sort of well-known specialty dedicated clubs that have been there for decades, and they usually have their own dedicated building, whereas a local club like mine generally rents space from a public venue and equipment is not provided. So you need to purchase your chess equipment and bring it, because what's happening, I'm getting players showing up to the club and both that person and his or her opponent don't have equipment. So what does equipment mean? A regulation roll-up tournament board, like one of those vinyl boards. They also make them with that sort of mouse pad, that spongy, rubbery mouse pad material, which I really like. I have one of those myself because no matter how you treat it or fold it, it always stays flat. It's really, really nice. You have to have pieces, and for pieces, it should be the standard Staunton style, as they say, not those ornate and oversized pieces where the pawns are almost the same size as the bishops. I can't stand those. I call them like those bubble pieces because the pawns look like these bubbles. But very often, the pawn is almost the same size as the bishop, which really drives me crazy. I just like the standard traditional Staunton style, where the height of the pieces is clearly different. It's very clear which piece is what. I'm not into those ornate sets. And a little test, it's not really foolproof, but it's pretty accurate. What you should do is on one of the squares on the board, you should put 4 pawns, like in a square and, on the square, like in each corner. And if the pawns fit in that square, or maybe there's a slight overlap, then you know it's the right size as far as the proportion of the pawns to the size of the board. If the pawns go significantly over the size of the square, they're probably too big. Now, that's just one test. I also don't like, as I said, when the pawns are really tall and the pieces are oversized. Maybe that's my OCD, but I am the type of player where I will say something to my opponent, or as a TD, if someone says, that's not really a regular tournament style, so to speak, I will generally honor that. I've also had players come to the club where the black pieces are red, because obviously it's black and white. The black pieces are generally black, right? Like a normal shade of black. And the white pieces are usually like an off-white, like a beige. That's normal. But I've seen players where the white pieces will be fine, but then the black pieces, like I said, are like red. And some guys don't mind that. But I saw one set where not only the black pieces were red, but it was this very ornate sort of non-tournament style. So that's something to keep in mind. But you got to get your own equipment. All this stuff can be purchased on Amazon and elsewhere. They're relatively inexpensive and they last for years. I mean, unless you're throwing it against a wall and stepping on it or something, the plastic pieces and the roll-up boards will last for years. You spend a minimal amount of money. It's an investment, very minor, and it'll last you really a lifetime. There's really no reason, at least for several years anyway. And as I said, the sort of rubberized boards where it's almost like a mouse pad type of synthetic vinyl, I don't know what you would call it, but it's like sort of a synthetic rubbery type of thing. Those are really durable. I have one myself. I bought it about 6 months ago because I was using the vinyl boards. I really like it. But as I said, what's happening at our club is that 2 players who are paired are showing up without equipment, and it's very frustrating because now I have to take the time to scramble to see if someone has an extra board. And I do have extra clocks as a TD, but those are not meant for general use. The extra clocks I have are really for emergencies, like if a clock breaks down in the middle of a game, or if there's an illegal move situation where I have to add 2 minutes and maybe I don't know how to use that person's clock and I'll use my own. So the clocks I have, again, are for, where I have to make rulings or I find in the middle of the game that a clock was defective, things like that. So if I give those away in the beginning before the round starts, simply because people forgot, then I don't have those where those situations arise, where I need to put a clock on the table for the 2 opponents. And just remember, the player with the black pieces, as per US chess rules, has the right to use his or her equipment unless that person shows up late, of course. And remember, if you show up late, you can't stop the game and say, okay, let's reset the board with my equipment. You can't do that. The person with the black pieces also decides which side of the clock the board goes on. But again, if that person is late and the clocks have started, you forfeit that right. And the only way the player with the black pieces cannot use his or her equipment if, he or she shows up on time would be if, as a TD, I deem that equipment to not be of regulation standards. It is subjective. It's going to vary between TDs. A lot of players I know, they really don't care what the equipment is like, even if it's that fancy, ornate style. Other players like myself are a little more OCD about that. You have the right to speak up if you feel your opponent is not using regulation equipment. A lot of people don't like to say anything, but that is your right. That's why the TDs are there. And lastly, for the crew at the club, but this applies to everybody, you are responsible for your personal belongings. You need to do a once-over where you were sitting, make sure you have everything before you leave. And I will tell the crew at my club, I'm not responding to emails anymore asking if, hey, Neil, did you happen to see this umbrella I left behind? Hey, Neil, did you happen to see this cushion I left behind? I'm not responding to those anymore. That's not me. That's a you thing. That's not a me thing. That's my public service announcement. So I sort of did get a little bit local there this one time. But again, I think that applies to club players in general. So those are my thoughts to you as a tournament director. So now let's put that aside, and I want to make a right turn and change gears and give my thoughts on chess study activities. Specifically, I'm going to focus on and discuss chess exercises and activities that are either neglected or they're activities that are ineffective or inappropriate for the person's current level. So in other words, there are certain things that people aren't studying that they should. There are certain things that they are studying where they're not aware that it's not covering certain areas that you need to cover. So I'm going to go through this, and this really has to do with gaps in people's knowledge and studying the wrong things. And it really has to do with understanding what the exercise is helping you with. As I go through each one, it'll become clearer. I'm sorry if that explanation sounded a little convoluted, but as I take these specific activities one at a time, I think it will become clear. So let's begin. So the first chess study exercise that people do, or types of exercises that people do, are what I call offense-only activities. Now, these activities are good. Don't get me wrong, I use them myself. But what many don't realize is that they neglect a major aspect of the game and chess improvement in general. So, for example, mate in 1 or mate in 2 puzzles, tactical puzzles, puzzle rush, those are all good. Again, I use them myself. But as I mentioned, there's 2 issues with these types of exercises. Maybe you know what those are. The first, with those types of exercises, white to mate in 2, a tactical puzzle that wins a piece, things like that, you're given like half the answer. Think about it. Part of the solution is provided for you. If it's a mate in 2, you know it's a mate in 2. You're going to look for mating nets. You're going to look for checks. If it's a tactical puzzle where you win a piece, you're going to look for those types of offensive moves. In a tournament, no one is going to give you those enormous hints. No one's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, it's a mate in 2. Hey, you have a tactic here. You have to have the skill and the chops to identify that yourself. So that is one flaw of those puzzles, is that they're framed where, as I said, they're pretty much giving you a head start. They're giving you half the answer. It would be like taking a multiple choice test, A, B, C, or D, and on each question they say, okay, on this one it's either A or B, just so you know. It's almost like that. The second gap with these types of exercises is that generally they neglect what is arguably the biggest issue with amateur players, and that is not being aware of or not properly assessing the opponent's threats, not thoroughly checking if your move is safe and if your opponent has a refutation. In other words, these exercises are all offense-based, generally. They don't force you to think defensively. Now, you could argue to a certain extent they do, because even if it is a tactical puzzle, you have to check that it works. I get it. But still, what happens is people who do this, they often get into such an offensive mindset that they don't think about their opponent's plans when they sit down for a tournament game. And again, I'm going to repeat what I said. Not properly assessing the opponent's threats, not seeing his or her ideas, that is probably the biggest problem for amateur players. You only think of your own plans and you don't thoroughly investigate your opponent's ideas. And I think with a lot of these tactical puzzles and puzzle rush, as I said, it doesn't really force you to think defensively, at least not enough. You need to look at puzzles where it's almost like, okay, it's not white to move and win a knight. It's white to move because black has a threat, or black to move because white is threatening something and you have to figure out what it is. Or it's white to move and you have to figure out, is it a positional idea you need to do? Is it a tactical idea? Something like that. So I would suggest something like, and this is just one example, the book Practical Chess Exercises by Ray Chang. I'll put a link for it. I've spoken about this book before. What he did, what Ray Chang did, he's an amateur player. The entire book are puzzles where you don't know what type of solution is required. In other words, He simply puts the position, he tells you whether it's white or black to move, and you have to figure it out. You have to figure out the whole thing from scratch. Those are the types of exercises that you want. Why? Because those will emulate tournament conditions. No one is going to tell you in a tournament what the correct idea is, whether you need to defend, whether it's offense, etc. And that's what I love about this book. I'm sure there are other courses and online puzzles and other books with similar exercises. That's just the one that comes to mind. It's fantastic. It's basically, okay, white to move. And you have to figure it out. Do I have to defend against something? Is there a mate? Is it tactical? You're given no clue as to what the solution is. Whereas with most standard tactical puzzles, you already know, okay, you're going to win a piece or it's going to be mate. But these sort of no clue puzzles, that's what you want because it really forces you to think. It forces you to look at the whole board and understand the whole position. And your understanding is much more thorough. That's the type of study I believe that will transfer to your tournament games, your OTB tournament games. All right, but practical chess exercises is excellent. There really should be more books and exercises and online stuff like that, where it's simply a position, black to move, and that's all the information you're given. So something to keep in mind, you have to work on your defensive skills as well. All right, the next study habit that is sometimes flawed for many is that your playing to studying ratio is off for your particular needs. Now, that's sort of a controversial discussion point in chess improvement. How much should you play versus how much should you study? Many play, but do little studying, and many study and do little playing. Now, the players who claim that they, quote unquote, got better just by playing, right? I got better just by playing. And they're out there. I've had a few even on the podcast who I interviewed. Those are the exceptions. That's not going to work for most people in my view. And again, I know those stories are out there. Well, I got better just by playing, right? I just played online or I just played in tournaments. That's going to happen for some people. I do believe, again, those are the exceptions. I also don't think that there is a universal one-size-fits-all play to study ratio. It's going to vary from person to person, but you need to experiment to find that sweet spot, if you will. For example, someone who has a decent overall knowledge of the game, but loses often simply because of nerves, that person would need to play more, because I don't know if dealing with nerves and composure is something that you can study. Another example, if you have someone else who's relatively composed and calm at the board, but he misses basic tactics and loses end games because he doesn't know basic king and pawn versus king theory, that person would need to study more. And again, I don't believe there's a universal answer. It's a case-by-case basis, but you have to find that sweet spot. You have to know if you need to play more or study more. And again, if you're blundering a lot due to nerves, things like that, you probably just need to play more. There are some things that are just going to come with experience. I believe that. There are some things where studying is just not going to help you. You just need to actually clean it up in the tournament hall. And that might mean dealing with a lot of losses. It might mean falling on your face a lot, but you'll eventually clean it up. There are other things, as I said, other players, I should say, where they're losing games just because they lack the most basic theoretical knowledge, like for the opening, middle game, end game. Those people obviously need to study more. But you got to find that balance. I don't think it's correct to give a number. Some people and coaches like to give a number. Well, if you're rated this should be your play to study ratio. If you're rated this, I don't agree with those one size fits all type of thing. You got to kind of see what works for yourself. But being aware of your playing to studying ratio and how it's affecting your chess improvement is very, very important. We're now going to take a short break and we'll be back with more thoughts on chess improvement exercises and activities. Next, you need to analyze your games with a chess engine. So important. I've said that a number of times on this podcast. This includes online games as well, rather than just hopping into the next game one after the other. I mean, if you're online, like if you're on chess.com, let's say, there's really no excuse because you can click the analyze button and the engine is right there. And you need to do that. Playing is important, but you have to analyze your games afterwards. Your over the board tournament games, right? Your OTB classical games, you definitely need to spend a lot of time with the engine. That is one of the most fundamentally important study tools for improvement. I do not agree that amateurs should not use an engine. That is a school of thought that's out there. It makes no sense to me. You need to understand where you went wrong. Now, the engine may not give you full understanding of some of the subtleties, but it'll definitely help you with ideas. It'll definitely help you with tactics and mates and things like that, because that's where the engine is going to be 100% accurate. If you missed or your opponent missed a tactic, the engine is going to catch that, and we all need help with tactics. But you really, really need to analyze your games, and maybe you were thinking of an idea during the game, but you didn't play it. Explore that in the engine. Don't just look at the moves that were played. Look at other ideas you had during the game. All those thoughts that go through your mind during the game, plug those into the engine. Go down those rabbit holes and see where it goes. It's so important. And again, it's really baffling to me when people suggest that amateurs should not use an engine. I just don't agree with it. It's extremely, extremely important. It should be a major fundamental part of your improvement plan. Now let's talk about opening study. I believe that the idea that you shouldn't spend time on openings until you're higher rated is wrong, or not really wrong, but it's overblown, because that's the belief, right? Don't really spend time on openings, just spend time on tactics. I disagree with that. I disagree with the idea that you should only spend maybe 10% of your time on openings if you're a developing player. I agree you shouldn't spend most of your time on it, but you have to spend some time on it. I think what happens is players hear a GM say something like, don't spend too much time on openings until you're stronger. But then what happens is there's this overcorrection and they reduce the amount of time they spend on openings, but it's almost too much time. In other words, they neglect openings a little too much. To say to spend, 10% on openings, that's a little low. Now, the amount of time you should spend on openings should be determined by the following, because obviously this is going to vary from person to person depending on your opening knowledge and how your games are going. But here's a quick sort of 3-part formula on how you can determine how much time you should spend on openings, in my opinion. And a few of these you've heard me say before. So the first thing, are you consistently getting playable middle games where you are equal, slightly better, or much better? Is that happening most of the time? If yes, if most of the time you're getting to a middle game where it's playable, the amount of opening study you're doing is probably good. It's probably right where it should be. Second thing, do you have a set repertoire that you like and that you're comfortable with? As I've always said, you want to set it and forget it. Stick with the same openings. That's going to save you a huge amount of time. But what I notice is people play openings, even an opening that's part of a set repertoire, that they really don't like, or that they're just not comfortable with, or that they don't know that well, and they're sort of in denial about it. Like they'll say, for example, okay, I play the Sicilian as black, or like a certain variation of the Sicilian as black. But the truth is they're really not comfortable with it, but they just do it anyway. That's not good. You should be excited to play the openings that you choose. Stick with the same openings and set it and forget it. That's going to take some experimentation. But if you're playing like a zillion types of different openings, you're going to be, you're never going to be set. You're going to be constantly studying and worrying about this. Whereas if you play the same openings, you know what the positions are going to be like. You know what the middle games are going to be like. And because you have a set repertoire, you can use your study time on other things. That's something I've mentioned before, but that never gets old because I just think it's so important. And then the third thing to determine how much time you should spend on openings, do you understand the themes, plans, and ideas for the openings you play? Do you understand what the goals are? In other words, you can't just memorize moves. Simply memorizing moves, oh, well, if I go here, then I'm supposed to, he does this, then I'm supposed to do this. If you do that without understanding the ideas, you're wasting your time. Because remember, most amateur games are going to go off book pretty quickly for the most part. Now, yeah, you're going to have your games where if it's an opening, you both know, and you're both kind of book players, you might be in book 12, 13, 14 moves. I've had games like that, but those are the exceptions. Most amateur games, it's going to veer off book pretty quickly. And if you don't understand the themes and ideas and the plans, you're going to be really stuck, and you're going to get into time pressure, things like that. So you can't rely just on memorization. So that's why you want to choose openings where you understand the themes and ideas. That's the reason, for example, that I play the French defense against E4. I've done well with it. I think a lot of players with the white pieces don't handle the French very well at our level. But with the French defense, regardless of which variation, whether it's the advanced variation or the exchange, whatever it is, I understand the ideas for black, like where the pieces should go, what my plans are, different formations. But if the opening you're playing for black, let's stick with that example, right? Against E4, if you're sticking with an opening that you're really not comfortable with and you constantly have insecurities about it, well, you got to do two things. You either need to learn that opening better, or you need to find a new opening. But you should be excited to play your openings. After 1E4, you shouldn't get nervous. You should be excited to respond to that. As white, you should know exactly what you're going to play and be excited to respond to whatever black throws at you. If you're still having insecurities with your openings, like I said, you got to learn them better or you got to change them. Going back to the original theme, you shouldn't spend too much time on openings if you're sort of a developing player. As I said, it's overblown, and many players make an overcorrection and they actually spend too little time on openings. You have to spend some time on openings. Now, yeah, of course, you shouldn't spend 80% of your study time on openings. I agree with that there. But something like 10%, that's a little too low. But your goal, again, is to get middle games where you have a playable position, where you're equal, slightly better, or much better. That's the acid test. When you start doing that on a regular basis, then you know you're heading in the right direction. The next study habit that I want to mention is that for many players, there is no scaffolding or logical progression of their study plan. That is, for many players, their chess study is desultory. It's piecemeal. They're all over the place. They're working through a book or a course that's not appropriate for their level because there are certain basics they haven't mastered yet. The example I always use is that if you're still hanging pieces, if you're still missing very basic mates in one, like a back rank mate, or you're losing material to very elementary tactical shots, things like that, we've all been there, you shouldn't be reading Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual or a book on Garry Kasparov's best games. You're not there yet. And this is a major reason why people who study a lot, right, they quote unquote study a lot, I study all the time, they see little improvement. It's because their study material is not building on what came before it. That's what we mean by scaffolding. They're studying material where absorption of that material is not going to happen, or it's only going to be very little because there's prior knowledge that they need to understand that material that they didn't get to yet. A better way of saying that, they're reading a book with advanced material where they're still struggling with the basics. So that advanced material is not going to penetrate. All right. And again, that's why players who say, well, I study all the time, but I'm not improving, that's probably a major reason why, or at least one of the reasons why, is that they skipped things that they already needed to know instead of working in a logical progression. An even simpler way of saying it is that people are studying material that's too difficult or just not appropriate for them. And instead, they should be filling gaps in their knowledge that should have already been taken care of. Now, The Amateur's Mind, I love that book by I. M. Jeremy Silman. That's a great book for that. Not only is that a great book for general improvement, I think it is required reading, but the thing with The Amateur's Mind, it'll really make you understand where your gaps are. That's the type of book where every other page or almost every page you're going to be like, oh, geez, I didn't know that. Oh my goodness, I didn't know that. So something to think about. Definitely read The Amateur's Mind. If for no other reason, then I think it's going to really help you understand where your gaps are, where the voids are in your knowledge. And then you'll be able to better gauge what material is appropriate for you and what material isn't. Now, speaking of inappropriate study material, a lot of players study game collections too soon. And I mean game collections by GMs, by top-level players. Now, once you're a decent club level player, like 1400 and above, let's say, then I think game collections can help. But for players who are still in that sort of developing phase, like 1,000, 1,100 around there, I think game collections are premature. And again, of course, I mean game collections from GM level players. Studying amateur games, that's a different story. We're going to talk about studying amateur games in vivid detail next week. I'm going to hold off until then because that's a completely different ecosystem. Now, with Grandmaster game collections, yeah, they're fun to read, they're entertaining, and sure, they're instructive for developing players to a certain degree, but most of the time, there is not going to be any transference to your over-the-board tournament games and results. So you're going to read some game collection by Philidor or Fisher, whatever it is, and then you're going to sit down at your over-the-board tournament game, which is what it's all about, and trust me, there's going to be no transference. All that stuff's just going to go right out the window because the type of knowledge and just practical experience you need, it's not going to come from reading GM game collections. It's not going to be applicable to your tournament games generally. Now, I know what you're going to say. You hear about how top players reviewed hundreds of master games, right? When masters talk about how they built their strength, oh, I looked at hundreds or thousands of master games. But what you don't hear was that they were already competent players before they started doing that. Most of them were not doing that as beginners. They were already decent players who had the basics down before they looked at quote unquote hundreds of master games. If you're new to the game, if you're a beginner, again, you're not there yet. All right. And that's kind of a big theme with a lot of what I'm talking about today. You have to study certain material when you're ready for it, when it's appropriate. Now, the final theme or idea, if you will, is not taking the game seriously. This is for online chess. Now, with over-the-board chess, you're in full-blown tournament conditions. It's in person. You've driven to the club. You've made arrangements. Completely different environment and mindset. In other words, with OTB chess, it's almost impossible not to take the game seriously. Like you're sitting there. It's a whole thing. It's the whole live experience. Online chess, completely different. You could be in your pajamas on your couch with your phone. And so that changes the mood and the vibe right there. Now, for some people, probably myself included, it's inherently more difficult to take the game seriously online because it's not the same live, tactile experience as over the board. Online, players tend to take more risks. They're less careful. They'll play, again, riskier moves that they normally wouldn't do in an over-the-board situation. And a lot of times when people play online, they're doing it, quote unquote, for fun, or they're letting off steam after a long day. They are multitasking. They have other tabs open, things like that. Now, if you play chess that way, that is a very insidious approach that over time is going to damage your chess and lead to poor habits in the OTB world. Now, some people might think I'm sort of catastrophizing a little bit, like that's overblown. I don't think so. If you want to get better, remember, we're putting this in the context of chess improvement. If you want to get better, it has to be like you're at the club. That needs to be the mindset. So that mindset you have when you actually drive to the club or travel to a weekend tournament and you're there live facing another human, that's the mindset when you play online. You have to emulate tournament conditions as much as possible. And that's not always easy to do. And one more thing, I'm going to end with this. If you play bullet chess regularly, like several hours a week as an amateur player, I question how serious you are about improving. Just my opinion. If you play bullet chess all the time, like if that's all you do, it's almost like you're just dabbling. I mean, really, like 1-0 bullet chess, everyone's pre-moving. It's junk chess, as far as I'm concerned. I know it can be fun for people, and that's fine, but the reason it bothers me is that there are so many other productive chess activities you could be doing with your time that will actually help you improve. And I'm amazed at how many amateur players complain about their chess progress, yet they play hours and hours of bullet chess a week. That is utterly mystifying to me. Now, to put this in context, I'm talking about adult improvers who are serious about getting better. If you're a recreational player and you're not concerned about improvement, knock yourself out. If you're playing blitz chess just as sort of an activity, the way you would play Candy Crush on your phone, knock yourself out. but I really think it's going to lead to some poor habits. I don't think it's really going to help your over-the-board classical chess. I know I might sound a little old school here and a little uptight, but I really would avoid bullet chess like those 1-0 games. I really don't think it's going to do anything for your game. So that will do it for this week. Just some thoughts on effective and ineffective study habits, some things people may not be aware of, and I wanted to make clear that certain activities, while they're good, they're often very one-sided. There's another aspect of the game that they don't cover. I think the biggest takeaway for me out of this whole list, if I had to pick one, it would really be the first one. The idea of doing chess exercises that are only offensive-minded. You're thinking about your plan, what you're going to do, and the exercise doesn't really force you to think about your opponent's plan, because I'm going to repeat what I said at the beginning of this segment. The biggest problem with amateur players is not correctly assessing the opponent's threats, not being aware of his or her ideas. Really, really important, really something to think about. But at any rate, really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.